Counsel Calucci.
Present.
Present Counsel Field.
Present.
Present Counsel Hogan.
Present.
Present Counsel LaPierre. Absent Counsel Lozey.
Present.
Present Counsel Net.
Present.
Present Counsel Starbird. Absent Counsel Walsh.
Present.
Present Counsel Seer. Absent.
And this is the Lynn Planning Service Review? Okay. If you move those microphones, you know what, you could probably move after this table when you down these microphones. If you want to stand or sit.
Yeah, that's fine.
You can put your chairs up there. Like a congressional hearing.
Right, the congressional hearing, that's right.
Right. Just drill.
That's right.
Yeah, well, thank you for having us come before you again. As you might recall, we had come to speak with the council in October of last year, and at the time, we were presenting on some of the short-term recommendations that we had made relating to building greater planning capacity for the city of Lynn. So we made those recommendations then, but as part of the remit for the work that we were doing for Mayor McGee, we were also asked to look at what, longer-term recommendations could be, actually trying to create a planning department and a broader planning function in the city of Lynn. So that's what we wanted to talk to you about today. As far as, the ultimate goals of the project, I think we had spoke about these before, but, we were asked to make recommendations to the mayor and to the city council to look at, what the best planning function for Lynn could be, maximizing resources and capacity, identifying new resources and opportunities, and also providing the support the city needs to have an effective planning function in the city. And, as over the last year, we did a number of things to kind of, to achieve this project. One was, to review existing planning capacity and resources across Lynn. So we spoke to, a number of the people here and all the department heads and a lot of outside parties and developers as well. We looked at practices and structures in comparable cities, and we also then developed some of the recommendations. So what we're going to talk about today is the long-term recommendations we've made and why we think they're important. What are some of the key components of municipal planning that, most cities that are comparable to Lynn possess to some degree, and what those functions look like, and then ultimately what are the options that Lynn has to consider in creating a planning department. So that's what we have on tap today, if that's okay with the council. Well, yeah, so just moving on to why we believe this is important. I mean, I guess the first thing to say, and it's clear, from all the conversations and exploration we had done, that there is a lot of development activity happening in Lynn, and there's a positive attitude from Lynn city officials, for seeing more development happen. I mean, I think the city, a lot of the development community and others see the city as open for business in a place that's pretty easy to work with. Obviously the arts and culture stuff has been something that Lynn's becoming more widely known for, and there's economic benefits to that. And there's just a strong commitment to smart growth and development across the city. And I believe that's shared by federal and state officials that want to see Lynn prosper. So there's a lot of really good, building blocks, and the context for Lynn is pretty positive in that sense. But, I think it's clear in the conversations that we had with a range of folks that are both work within Lynn city government, but also otherwise, that there are real challenges. And, some of those, one thing to note is that Lynn is the largest municipality in the Commonwealth that doesn't have a professional land use planner on its payroll. And there's not really a central department, responsible for all the functions of a contemporary planning department, in the city. And in that sense, planning-related functions are dispersed across a number of different agencies and departments. The city doesn't have a master plan or something comprehensive that would guide its growth and development over the next, 10 to 20 years. I think, as we had mentioned at our last session with you all, transportation planning and coordination was particularly cited as a deficit. zoning besides some of the kind of neighborhood zoning, like what's happened with downtown, hasn't been reviewed comprehensively in many years. And I think a lot of people thought that, the planning process wasn't always able to build in a significant amount of community engagement, and that was something that some people had mentioned as a gap. So I'm going to hand over to Ralph Wilmer, who's our senior land use planner at MAPC, or principal planner, to talk about what are the key components of municipal planning. Give that context.
Thank you. So when we talk about municipal planning departments, there are numerous functions that such a department would undertake on any given day. And to sort of try to keep things simple, we broke it down into two major categories. One is development review. Obviously, any time that a development proposal is brought before a city or a town, it's incumbent upon that city or town to undertake a review, and it's got permitting authority to ensure that the applicable planning and zoning laws are adhered to. And then there's this long-range planning aspect to it. So when we talk about development review, we're certainly, we would be including a review of a project as it relates to your zoning ordinance, making sure that it complies with the use regulations, the dimensional regulations, things along those lines. There are permitting processes that have to be undertaken, predominantly local ones under your zoning and maybe other land use regulations, but sometimes projects are large enough that they trip permitting requirements at the state level, and a planning department would be responsible for coordinating that review as well. And then finally, with respect to the Lynn ordinance in particular, you do have a site plan review process. And in a typical scenario, a professional planner would provide advice to a planning board or a zoning board of appeals to do any of those things as it relates to the development review process. And then ideally, a planning department would be involved with long-range planning, whether that's undertaking a master plan that looks at all aspects of land use in a given city or town, or more specific issues such as transportation and parking, historic preservation, community development related activities, housing, economic development, arts and culture. They typically have a GIS department to look at geographical information systems and the like. And the planner or planners would be involved in undertaking that process and coordinating the activities of all the related departments that would be involved in that particular process.
Thanks, Rob. So I mean, that's kind of when today in a lot of communities, when you identify the kind of range of planning activities that a contemporary planning department could provide, that's often what you see. And I think if you just turn to the next page, we had been asked to look at, just what you find in other cities in Massachusetts that we thought were comparable, both, for size and population, but also, with some of the demographic issues, commonalities that they have with Lynn. And I think what, we found was, generally they have brought a lot of these planning functions together. I mean, they certainly weren't uniform. I mean, there wasn't a standard where they've all adopted the same type of structure and the same format. And I generally think, that works. There's different histories to communities and different priorities that they have, and some range of options is right. But I mean, I would think, when you think about the core components, I mean, they really have brought those pieces together in, planning, zoning, housing, community development are generally seen as brought together in a single department. And I would say all of them then had, a number of positions that were dedicated to certified planners. So it, not only did they bring the different functions together, but there also was, they had brought in that type of expertise into those departments. So that's what we found, when we looked at these communities. But like I said, there is some range there, and that means a city that wanted to move in this type of direction, they would have options, and we'll talk about some of the options that Lynn has. And feel free, if you have any questions at any point, to interrupt. We're glad to answer them throughout. But yeah, so on the next page, relating to choices and options, I mean, we sort of, thought about, well, on the one hand, you could do kind of a simply, planning-based option to build planning capacity and have sort of a planning and development department, where they would look after both development review, as described by Ralph, and then also some of the long-range planning, where they'd have people looking at, zoning, master planning comprehensively, but then also issues where the city doesn't really have any planning support currently, like for transportation issues. But this would leave, community development, economic development, housing independent. That would just be kind of building kind of a strong core planning team, at the center of city government. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you would be able to potentially look at bringing it all together. And that's what, I think cities like Lowell, Quincy and other cities, that are similarly sized have thought about. And they've brought planning and development departments together where planning functions, as described before, are together with community development, housing, and economic development, all in sort of a department that's looking across the piece at those range of issues, and bringing in the variety of professionals that would do lead on those issues, together in a single department with a department head that would oversee all of that. And I think, in more cases than not, a lot of the cities and communities we'd looked at had something that were generally along those lines. But obviously, that might have evolved over time and years. They didn't probably get there overnight. So if you're thinking about how to get, forward from where Lynn is now, potentially, to, building greater planning and development capacity, what could that look like? So we actually put together what we considered a recommended option, which we kind of branded as building a strong core. And, there we thought, it was possible to bring together, the core planning functions we had identified around development review and long-range planning, inclusive of master planning and that comprehensive side of things, and then also transportation. Also together with the community, the parts of community development in Lynn that often are meant to support those type of functions. So the community development block grant oversight and the grants management. Obviously, the community development department in Lynn plays a broader role than what's described here. There's an arts, there's a facilities and arts component to what they do, which is quite important, whether it's managing the auditorium and all the shows that come through Lynn, or, some of the parks and recreational spaces. But so we thought, take those core pieces of community development and work those into a planning and development department as a way of, creating sort of a strong planning function. And I guess when we think about what are the benefits of this structure, I mean, one, we thought, it builds that strong core to manage the development review and comprehensive planning. It enables, coordination of development activity across the city government. It provides, I think, part of it was also like, what is the staffing needed for that? We think it provides enough support for both the planning board to receive the support it needs, the ZBA, the city council, as well as the mayor. You are all the parties to the planning process in Lynn, and all need, expert support to provide it. What it would do also is, retain the strengths of some of the, quasi-public bodies and independent authorities that Lynn city government supports, like land, the housing authority, as well as EDIC. They would retain an independent function, but would, obviously work within this framework to be coordinated under planning. And it also could enable, other creative reforms and departmental functions, as well. Like I mentioned, the arts and culture. I mean, there's a number of cities and towns across the state who in recent years have started to create their own arts and cultures departments. Small departments usually, but, to the degree that Lynn has a significant arts and culture footprint, and that is something that your community development department currently plays a leadership role on, you might want to think about, spinning that off and really building on what I think many people see as a strength for the city. So those are some of the ideas there. I mean, as far as what the staffing we thought for this recommended option, we sort of ballparked it in the range of 8 to 12 personnel, with a director, 2 to 3 senior planners, a community development manager, 1 or 2 community development specialists that work on, grants management and projects, and then a few junior planners and admin support, which would obviously, be needed for the planning board, which they have now, and assist the director. And I think one thing to say about that, when you think about, 8 to 12 positions, these aren't necessarily all new people. To some degree, they could be drawn from, existing staff that are already here. So this isn't just, 8 to 12 new bodies you'd have to be bringing in. It might just be, a part of what you'd be forming here. You'd be, taking resource or deriving that resource, from existing places. Sure, Counselor.
Thank you. So is that becoming the norm now for communities to bring those departments all under one umbrella?
I mean, in everything we've looked at, that seems to be the case. I mean, and we were looking at, cities where there is, these departments are much more sizable than if you were looking at, smaller communities. But yes, in a lot of the cities we've looked at, they have these functions brought together. And I guess the idea being that, you're really linking up both your development control side, your review side, which is, the statutory process for considering development, with that longer range and comprehensive planning function. But in most places have moved in that direction. Sure.
Thank you. Of these communities that have listed, are any of these communities, have they had these planning departments operating for over 5 years? What's the period of each of these? Are they in the infancy, or have they been established for a number of years, and what's the measurement of as far as production?
Yeah, my sense is, I mean, and that's something, I don't know the answer for all of them, but you might, yeah.
For the most part, decades.
Decades. Okay,
Yeah,
good.
they're well established, especially when you think about cities like Newton, Lowell, New Bedford, Salem in particular. So all of those have been around for at least 2 or 3 decades.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, I do think, and you probably know better than I do. Like, I mean, Lynn, at one point, I believe there was a planning department in Lynn, and and I think maybe in the 70s or 80s that was, that ended, and the functions were, dispersed in other places. But yeah, I think these, as Ralph says, these have existed for some time, and, I think they're pretty standard in some form or function. So.
None of them are new.
That's what. Thank you.
I think there was a question.
Sure.
Hi. The back page,
Yeah.
is this goals for the city, or is this something MAPC would provide, or, I mean, specifically, you mentioned providing support. Is this like a goal of the new planning board, or is this something that can be provided towards establishing this?
Well, I think when we thought about, these were goals for, for the project that we're working on. And,
Okay,
and
so
I think this was,
not for the, okay.
but
Because,
in a sense, it was like to look at, Lynn's planning functions and come up with some ideas for how Lynn could achieve these objectives.
yeah. and
So that was the idea.
Lynn's difficulty is our finances. When you list cities like Lawrence, they're receiving 70% of their revenue from the state. And unlike, Lynn, we're closer to 50%. But, I think some of those points, we would need them before we even created this. We need some resources and the funding for hiring a planning director and her support staff.
Yeah, I mean, clear, we make this presentation well aware of the fiscal challenges that Lynn faces. And we don't see this as something that could happen overnight. obviously this would take time, and a degree of resource. I mean, when we had presented, previously about the short-term recommendations, I mean, one of the subjects we touched upon was, there is a lot of support that parties want to provide for Lynn, whether they're state resources or even private sector resources to build planning capacity. I do think there is an appetite to support Lynn, and a number of different parties want to see Lynn succeed. And I think they believe part of that would be to build, greater planning capacity. And to the degree that Lynn, in the short term, was able to tap some of those resources, that might be an avenue to consider while the city is, rebuilding its own financial capabilities, and then over time be able to move to something, where you are, building up the planning capacity in a more structured manner. And, like I said, not all of this needs new money. Some of it might be, organizing and taking from the resources that Lynn has currently, and looking at how they can be organized differently. Cool. So that was, the recommended option we had identified, that we thought could benefit Lynn. And I mean, this slide, the next slide talks about some of the ramifications for other departments, and I did touch upon some of that earlier. But I mean, obviously, if you're gonna organize a planning department in this manner, it will impact departments that either currently have some of those functions or, or work closely with this new planning department. So obviously, your inspectional services department, which is where the planning function currently is located, would probably narrow their focus to building inspection, permitting, and facilities management if this change were adopted. Obviously, they'd still need to work very closely with planning because there's, building code and other, permitting processes that need to be joined up with planning. Your community development department would potentially, pieces of that would come into this new structure and work within the planning department. But like I said, a lot of communities are looking at arts and culture as a separate entity within city government, want to do more to support it. So, some cities have like a mayor's office for arts and culture. There's a lot of that happening in city government now. You might want to build on that. As far as EDIC goes, they still play an important role in business development and engagement. They still are a lending body. They would continue to play that role. And I think in that sense, they would be tightly looped into the planning process. And your housing authority, I mean, I think in a lot of cases, that would remain largely unchanged. I mean, they do work closely with the city now on a number of development projects. And I think, because I think they do a pretty damn good job, you would retain their capabilities on housing development and affordability. But then, make sure they're part of a close relationship with the planning department. One thing we had talked about in our last presentation was also, something that the mayor, I think, has already started to bring together, which is just, regular department head meetings across these different planning-related functions. And we've kind of branded it like a mayor's planning and development council. It makes sure that they're all on the same page. They know what every party's doing. They know what the big projects are in front of them. That's something that, is worth building on and could be staffed by a planning department, and would facilitate, under any structure, would facilitate, planning approval and planning processes in a more coordinated manner. So that's a real positive thing that the city's already starting to do, and you could build on it with this. So I mean, lastly, how would you implement this? I mean, obviously, one of the reasons, not only are there fiscal challenges that the city faces, and obviously those would have to be addressed if you were going to invest in some new capacity. But another feature of the city government structure is just that some of the organization of city government has been done through special act of the legislature. So if the city did intend to, for instance, create a planning and development department where the formal planning functions were held in that department, it would probably need to repeal and replace, I hate using that term, but, because other people have for other purposes, but but, repeal and replace what was Chapter 378 of the Acts of 2014, which created the Inspectional Services Department in the structure it currently has. If you did want to make that change formally within, Lynn City government to create a planning and development department, that would probably need to be replaced or repealed in some manner, and then, charter reforms and other things pursued. So that's something that would obviously need, the mayor's buy-in, the council's buy-in. It's not, council would have to give approval for, any further home rule petition to go forward. So that's something to just, make, I'm sure you're all aware of how the structures were created already, but that would need to be done if you wanted to move in this direction. So obviously, one thing that's good about it, it requires, this council's approval. It's not something the mayor can just do on their own. You would be an active party in making any change like that. So, but that's something that would need to happen as well. So yeah, any further questions or thoughts? Anything we could be looking at, or ideas or interests? We're here because we want to see Lynn do as well as possible, and we think these changes could be helpful over the long term. But obviously, that's for you to consider and deliberate, against the many challenges and issues you're looking at. So, any questions? Final remarks?
Do you have a business card?
Yeah, well, we can give you our information.
Give us
Sure.
all a business card, if you can. Thank you.
Sure.
I know I have enough.
Good, Ralph.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.